This is a photograph of a ghost. It is a picture of an aircraft that, by every known law of aerodynamics and physics, should not be flying. It should be a twisted ball of aluminum and human remains at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Look at the tail. The entire rear gunner station is gone, sheared away as if by a giant invisible hand. The horizontal stabilizers, the elevators that control the plane's pitch, are shredded, mangled beyond recognition. This is the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced, most complex, and most powerful bomber of the Second World War. And this one is flying without a tail. This is not the story of how a plane was damaged. This is the story of what happened in the seconds, minutes, and hours after the damage was done. It is the story of a crew that refused to die and a pilot who, faced with an impossible situation, invented a new way to fly, using nothing but raw nerve and the 4 massive engines at his command. November 21st, 1944. The air over Saipan was thick with humidity and the roar of engines, lined up on the tarmac were the silver titans of the 20th Air Force. The B-29 Superfortress was a quantum leap in aviation technology. It was a pressurized, high-altitude monster, capable of flying higher, faster, and farther with a heavier bomb load than any other aircraft on Earth. It was armed with a dozen .50 caliber machine guns, housed in remote-controlled turrets that were aimed by gunners sitting in comfortable, pressurized compartments, using a revolutionary new computer-assisted gun sight. It was, in theory, a flying fortress that could defend itself from all angles. It was America's war-winning weapon, designed to bring the fire war directly to the Japanese homeland. At the controls of one of these magnificent machines, christened Dauntless Dottie, sat Captain Robert Morgan. Morgan was not a rookie. He was a seasoned veteran, one of the most experienced bomber pilots in the Air Force. He had already completed a full tour of duty in Europe, flying B-17s over Germany as the pilot of the legendary Memphis Belle. He had seen it all. He had survived the flak, the fighters, the brutal air war over the Third Reich. Now he was here in the Pacific to take the fight to Japan. His crew of 10 men were a typical mix of young, confident Americans, a navigator, a bombardier, a flight engineer, and a team of gunners. In the very back of the plane, isolated in a small, cramped compartment all by himself, was a tail gunner, Sergeant Smitty Smith. His job was to watch their 6, to guard the rear of the aircraft from attack. It was the loneliest and most vulnerable position on the plane. The mission for the day was a daylight raid on the aircraft factories at Omura on the Japanese mainland. It was a grueling 16-hour round trip, a testament to B-29's incredible range. The flight to Japan was long and uneventful, hours spent droning over an endless blue ocean. As they approached the Japanese coast, the tension in the aircraft became a physical presence. The crew put on their flak helmets and checked their oxygen masks. The gunners scanned the sky, their eyes straining to catch the first glimpse of the enemy. The Japanese defense they faced was unlike anything Morgan had seen over Germany. It was not a calculated, professional opposition. It was a defense born of desperation and fanaticism. The Japanese knew that these silver bombers were a dagger aimed at the heart of their empire, and they would do anything to stop them. Their fighters were not just trying to shoot the B-29s down. They were trying to ram them. These were Tayatari or body crash attacks, a precursor to the organized kamikaze campaign that would follow. Young Japanese pilots, indoctrinated with the Bushido Code of Death before dishonor, would fly their planes directly into the massive American bombers, hoping to take one down in a final, suicidal blaze of glory. As Dauntless Dottie approached the target, the sky erupted. Japanese fighters, Ki-45 Nix and Ki-46 Dynas, swarmed the formation. They came in from all angles, their guns blazing. Morgan's gunners went to work, the remote-controlled turrets tracking and firing, a symphony of controlled destruction. Flak shells burst around them, peppering the fuselage with shrapnel. Dauntless Dottie shuddered as it took hits, but the big plane was tough. It held its course. Over the target, the bombardier's calm voice cut through the chaos. Bombs away. A string of high-explosive bombs fell from the belly of the B-29, hurtling toward the factories below. Their mission was complete. Now, they just had to survive the 8-hour flight home. Morgan banked the big bomber, turning back towards the sea. The gauntlet was not over. The Japanese fighters pressed their attacks with renewed fury. It was then that Morgan's top gunner shouted a warning over the intercom. "Fighter, 6 o'clock, coming in fast." He's not breaking off. Morgan glanced in his rear view mirror. He saw a twin-engine Japanese fighter, a Ki-45, climbing rapidly towards their tail. It wasn't making a normal gun run. It was on a collision course. "Smitty!" Morgan yelled into the intercom, warning the tail gunner. "He's coming right for you." Smitty's voice came back, calm and steady. "I see him, Captain. I'm firing." The twin .50 caliber guns in the tail began to bark, but the Japanese plane kept coming, boring in with suicidal determination. And then it happened. In the cockpit, Morgan and his crew felt a colossal, bone-jarring impact. A shudder so violent it felt as if the plane had been split in two. It was not the familiar jolt of flak. It was something far worse. A deafening roar echoed through the fuselage. The aircraft, a moment ago a stable, high-flying platform, was suddenly thrown into a terrifying, uncontrollable dive. Alarm shrieked. The nose pitched down violently, and the B-29 began to plummet towards the earth, its 4 engines screaming. The crew was thrown against their harnesses, weightless and helpless. Morgan grabbed the control yoke, pulling back with all his strength. It was useless. It was like trying to stop a freight train with his bare hands. The plane was not responding. They were going straight down. "What happened?" Captain Morgan yelled. His voice strained as he fought the controls. "What was that?" The intercom was a cacophony of frantic, overlapping reports. But one voice was missing. "Smitty?" "Smitty, report." Morgan shouted. The line to the tail gunner station was dead silent. The truth of their situation slowly dawned on the crew through the small side windows. The sky was not where it was supposed to be. They were in a near-vertical dive, spiraling out of control. Outside, a horrified debris field trailed behind them. Pieces of shattered plexiglass, twisted aluminum, and wires whipping the wind. The Japanese fighter had not just hit them. It had merged with them. The pilot, in a final act of suicidal devotion, had rammed his aircraft directly into the tail of dauntless Dottie. The entire tail gunner's compartment, along with Sergeant Smith, had been instantly sheared away from the rest of the plane, vanishing into the cold, empty sky. The impact had also destroyed most of their vertical and horizontal stabilizers. The tail of the aircraft, the crucial surfaces that provide stability and control, was a mangled, shredded wreck. The elevators, the control surfaces that allowed the pilot to make the plane go up and down, were gone. The rudder, which controls left and right movement, was gone. For an aircraft, this is a death sentence. A plane without a tail is not a plane. It is an unguided bomb. The B-29 was now a fundamentally unstable object, an aerodynamic nightmare, plunging towards the Japanese countryside. Morgan and his co-pilot, Captain Marvin D. Doc Watson, were wrestling with a dead machine. Pulling back on the control yokes had no effect. The elevators were no longer connected. They were just 2 men pulling on levers attached to nothing. The normal methods of flying an airplane had ceased to apply. In those first few frantic seconds, as the ground rushed up to meet them, Morgan prepared to give the order to bail out. It was the only sane choice. The plane was a goner. Their only hope was to jump and take their chances as prisoners of war in a country that was known for its brutal treatment of captives. But Robert Morgan was not a man who gave up easily. He was a pilot to his core. His instinct was not to abandon his ship, but to fly it. In the chaos of the dive, as the plane twisted and bucked, an idea sparked his mind, a desperate gamble born his deep, intuitive understanding of flight. He had no elevators. He had no rudder. But he still had 4 massive 3,000 horsepower Wright 3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each one controlled by its own throttle lever. He screamed at his flight engineer, Sergeant Woody Woodall, who sat just behind him. "Woody, give me full power on engines 1 and 2. Cut power on 3 and 4. Woody, without a moment's hesitation, slammed the throttles forward for the 2 left engines and pulled them back for the 2 right engines. The effect was immediate and violent. The sudden, massive surge of asymmetrical thrust acted like a giant, invisible rudder. The B-29, which had been spiraling to the right, shuddered and began to straighten out. The spiral stopped. They were still diving, but they were no longer tumbling out of control. It was a start. "It's working!" Morgan shouted. "Okay, now give me power on all four. Let's see if we can pull the nose up." Woody shoved all four throttles to the firewall. The four massive engines roared at maximum power. The sheer brute force thrust, with no elevators to counteract it, began to act on the airframe. Slowly, miraculously, the nose of the giant bomber, which had been pointed straight at the ground, began to lift. The terrifying dive shallowed out. They were pulling out. The altimeter, which had been unwinding at a catastrophic rate, slowed, stopped, and then began to climb. They had done it. They had wrestled the 60-ton beast back from the brink, just a few thousand feet above the ground. They were flying, but they were not in control. Not really. The plane was wildly unstable. It porpoised through the air, the nose rising and falling in a sickening, rhythmic oscillation. It wallowed from side to side, threatening to fall off into a spin at any moment. Morgan and Doc Watson discovered that they were no longer pilots in the traditional sense. They were now wrestling an untamed beast, and their only tools were the four throttle levers. They learned, through terrifying trial and error, that by increasing power on the two outboard engines 1 and 4, they could raise the nose. By increasing power on the two inboard engines 2 and 3, they could lower it. To turn left, they had to increase power on the right side engines and decrease it on the left, and vice versa. They were no longer fly with control surfaces. They were steering with pure differential engine thrust. It was an incredibly crude, clumsy, and exhausting way to fly. Every maneuver required a coordinated effort between the pilots calling out commands and the flight engineer manipulating the throttles. The slightest overcorrection, the slightest delay, and the plane would immediately try to plunge into another dive or spin. They were alive, and they were flying level, but they were still deep in enemy territory, in a crippled bomber that handled like a runaway truck on ice. Every Japanese fighter in the sky would be looking for the straggler, the wounded buffalo cut from a herd. Just as this thought crossed Morgan's mind, the top gunner's voice crackled over the intercom again, sharp with alarm. "Fighters! Bandits at 3 o'clock. Coming in fast." Morgan looked out his window. A group of Japanese fighters was peeling off and diving toward them, sharks smelling blood in the water. They were a sitting duck. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't evade. They were about to face a new test. Could this B-29, this flying wreck with no tail, still fight? The Japanese fighters closed in, their pilots confident they were about to finish off a helpless cripple. They had seen the catastrophic damage to the B-29's tail. They knew the bomber was barely flyable. This would be an easy kill. The lead Japanese pilot positioned his Key 45 on the B-29's right side, out of the line of fire of the forward turrets, and prepared for a beam attack. He was about to learn a terrible lesson about the B-29 superfortress. What the Japanese pilot didn't know was that the B-29's revolutionary defensive system was still fully operational. The General Electric remote-controlled turrets were a marvel of engineering. The gunners did not sit in the turrets themselves. They sat in comfortable, pressurized sighting blisters, using a computerized gun sight to aim the guns. This meant that one gunner could control multiple turrets, and the central fire control computer automatically calculated for factors like distance, airspeed, and bullet drop. When the attack came, the crew of Dauntless Dottie reacted with a cold, professional fury. The right side blister gunner, Sergeant Joe Gagliano, acquired the incoming fighter in his sight. He squeezed the trigger. The upper and lower turrets, both on the right side of the aircraft, swiveled in perfect unison and erupted in a storm of .50 caliber fire. The Japanese pilot, expecting to attack a defenseless bomber, flew directly into a solid wall of lead. His aircraft disintegrated in a flash of orange and black, a testament to the devastating, concentrated firepower of the superfortress. The other Japanese fighters, stunned by the ferocity of the defense from a plane they thought was already dead, pressed their attacks with a mixture of caution and fanaticism. For the next 20 minutes, the crew of Dauntless Dottie fought a running battle against a swarm of enemies. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't dodge. Their only defense was to fly straight and shoot. And shoot they did. The gunners, coordinated by Morgan, called out targets with calm precision. The turrets, guided by their miraculous computers, swiveled and fired, creating a protective sphere of destruction around the crippled bomber. They shot down another fighter, and then another. They were a wounded beast, but a beast that was still capable of goring its attackers. Finally, having exhausted their ammunition and lost several of their own, the remaining Japanese fighters broke off the attack and turned for home. Silence returned to the intercom. The crew of Dauntless Dottie had done the impossible. They had survived a ramming attack. They had recovered from an uncontrollable dive. And then, with no tail and barely able to fly straight, they had fought off and defeated a squadron of enemy fighters. It was a feat of airmanship and gunnery that was simply without precedent. But their ordeal was far from over. They were now alone, hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly base, flying over the vast, empty Pacific. The sun was beginning to set. They had won the battle, but they were still in a desperate struggle to survive the war. The flight was an exhausting, nerve-wracking nightmare. The B-29 was in a constant, sickening, porpoising motion, its nose rising and falling by hundreds of feet in a cycle that repeated every few minutes. The strain on the crew was immense. Morgan and Watson never took their hands off the controls, constantly making tiny adjustments to keep the wings level. Sergeant Woodall, the flight engineer, never took his hands off the throttles, his arms aching from the constant manipulation of the 4 levers. He was a man who was truly flying the plane, translating the pilot's commands into the delicate ballet of differential thrust that was keeping them in the air. As darkness fell, their situation became even more precarious. They were flying without instruments, as the crash had knocked out most of their navigation equipment. They were navigating by the stars, a small point of light in an infinite darkness of sky and sea. Every crew member was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. But there was a grim determination, a shared will to live that bound them together. They had come this far. They would not give up now. The greatest fear was a structural failure. The ramming attack had subjected the airframe to stresses it was never designed to withstand. The fuselage was creased and buckled. Rivets had popped. The entire structure was weakened. Every lurch, every groan of the metal, sent a fresh wave of fear through the crew. Would the wings hold? Would the buckled fuselage finally tear apart? They were flying a time bomb, and the clock was ticking. Hours passed. The drone of the 4 engines was the only sound. The crew sat in silence, each man alone with his thoughts, his fear, his hope. They were flying towards a tiny dot on the map, the island of Saipan, their home base. But finding a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at night, with no navigation aids, was a monumental challenge. Their navigator, Lieutenant Joe DeCourcy, was working with celestial map and a sextant, making calculations by flashlight, a desperate, old-fashioned race against their fuel consumption. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, a cry went up from the cockpit. "Land! I see land." It was Saipan. They had found it. A wave of indescribable relief washed over the exhausted crew. They had crossed the ocean. They had made it back to friendly territory. But the final, most dangerous part of their journey was still ahead. They now had to land this 60-ton, uncontrollable beast. A beast with no tail, no flaps, no elevators, no rudder, and no brakes. Landing AB-29 was a difficult procedure under the best of circumstances. What they were about to attempt was, by every measure, impossible. As Dauntless Dottie approached the airfield on Saipan, Captain Morgan got on the radio. His call sent a shockwave through the control tower. He calmly reported the situation. AB-29 returning from the mission with catastrophic structural damage. The entire tail section was gone. He had no control surfaces. He would be attempting a landing using only engine power for control. The tower operator was speechless. He had never heard of such a thing. He immediately cleared the field, ordering all other aircraft to land or divert. Fire trucks and ambulances, their sirens wailing, raced along the runway. The entire base came to a standstill as every man on the ground turned their eyes to the sky, waiting to witness what they were sure would be a fatal crash. In the cockpit, Morgan and his crew prepared for the endgame. Their plan was as desperate as it was brilliant. They would approach the runway at a much higher speed than normal to maintain some semblance of stability. They would use the throttles to control their descent. The moment the wheels touched the ground, Woody, the flight engineer, would cut all 4 engines. With no brakes, they would have to pray that the massive runway was long enough to slow them down before they ran out of asphalt. The margin for error was 0. If they came in too slow, the plane would stall and fall out of the sky. If they came in too fast, they would overshoot the runway and crash into the ocean at the other end. Morgan began his long, wide approach. He was fighting the porpoising motion of the plane, trying to time his descent to match the low point of the oscillation. It was like trying to land a bucking bronco. The men on the ground watched in stunned silence. They saw the B-29, its tail a mangled stump, wobbling through the air like a wounded bird. The sight was horrifying. It was a plane that had no right to be flying. They were watching a ghost come into land. "Okay, Woody." Morgan's voice was tense but steady over the intercom. "Get ready on those throttles. This is it." They crossed the threshold of the runway, traveling at nearly 140 miles per hour, far too fast for a normal landing. The ground rushed up. "Now!" Morgan yelled. Woody slammed all 4 throttle levers closed. The roar of the engines died instantly. The massive bomber, its source of life cut off, slammed onto the runway with a force that buckled the landing gear. The tires screamed in protest. Then one of them blew with a loud bang. The plane lurched violently to one side, careening off the center line, threatening to cartwheel. Morgan and Watson wrestled with the controls, using the differential braking on the remaining tires to try and keep the 60-ton beast straight. The B-29 hurtled down the runway, a runaway train of screeching metal and smoking rubber. It seemed to go on forever. It passed the halfway point, still moving at a terrifying speed. It passed the point where a normal landing would have stopped. The fire trucks and ambulances raced alongside it. The end of the runway and the dark blue of the Pacific Ocean beyond it grew closer and closer. Finally, with just a few hundred feet of asphalt to spare, the crippled bomber groaned, shuddered, and rolled to a stop. Silence. Then the sound of hundreds of men on the ground, mechanics, pilots, clerks, cooks, erupting into a spontaneous, thunderous cheer. They had witnessed a miracle. Inside the cockpit, the crew of Dauntless Dottie sat in stunned silence, their bodies trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. They were drenched in sweat, exhausted beyond measure. But they were alive. They were on the ground. They were home. When the ground crews were finally able to get a close look at the aircraft, they were speechless. The damage was beyond belief. The fact that the plane had held together at all was a testament to the rugged engineering of Boeing. But the fact that it had been flown for over 6 hours and then landed was a testament to something else entirely: the skill, courage, and unbreakable will of its crew. The story of Captain Robert Morgan and the crew of Dauntless Dottie became an instant legend in the 20th Air Force. The photograph of their tailless B-29 became one of the most iconic images of the war, a symbol of the incredible punishment these aircraft could endure and the extraordinary skill of the men who flew them. The story is more than just a tale of survival. It is a masterclass in crisis management and innovative thinking. When faced with an impossible situation, Captain Morgan did not give up. He did not blindly follow the emergency manual, which would have told him to bail out. Instead, he analyzed his resources. He had no control surfaces, but he had 4 powerful, independently controlled engines, and he invented a new way to fly. He was not just a pilot. He was an engineer in the sky, a problem solver who rewrote the rules of aviation in a desperate bid to save his crew. It is a story that reminds us that the most advanced technology in the world is only as good as the human beings who operate it. The B-29 was a marvel, but on that day, it was the courage, ingenuity, and teamwork of the 10 men inside it that made the difference between life and death. They were faced with certain doom, and they simply refused to accept it. They flew, they fought, and they brought their ghost of a plane home.